After her son's funeral, Grace Holloway thought the worst had already happened. She was wrong. Before the night was over, one cold conversation inside Michael's childhood home would turn grief into something far uglier. What should have been a time of mourning became the beginning of a bitter fight over loyalty, money, and the house Grace thought she would die in. And the most painful part was this. Michael had seen it coming long before anyone else did. The laughter came 3 hours after the burial. It was not loud. It was not wild. It was worse than that. It was short, dry, almost casual, as if the woman standing in the doorway of Michael Holloway's childhood home had just heard a private joke no one else deserved to understand. Grace Holloway was still wearing the same black dress she had worn to the cemetery. Her shoes were damp from the wet grass. Her hands smelled faintly of lilies because too many people had pressed flowers into them that afternoon, and too many people had said the same helpless things in the same careful voices. He was such a good man. He loved you so much. I still can't believe he's gone. Grace could not believe it either. Her son had been alive on Tuesday morning, leaving a half-drunk cup of coffee on the kitchen counter and promising to come by on Saturday to fix the sticking window in her back bedroom. By Tuesday night, a state trooper had been standing on her porch in the rain, hat in hand, telling her there had been an accident on Route 18 and that her son had died before she could reach the hospital. Nothing in her life had ever sounded real again after that. The house was nearly empty now. The casseroles were stacked in her refrigerator. The sympathy cards sat in a pile beside the lamp. Most of the relatives had gone. The pastor had hugged her twice. The neighbors had finally stopped asking whether she needed anything. What Grace needed was impossible. She was standing in the dining room, staring at the dark outline left on the wall where her husband's old clock had hung for 20 years, when Tessa walked in from the front hall. Michael's widow had not cried at the cemetery. Or if she had done it privately, away from the graveside, away from the family, away from the sight of Grace folding in on herself like paper in the wind. Tessa had held Lily's hand. She had accepted condolences. She had kept her chin high. She had looked pale, polished, and unreadable. Now she stood with one hand still on the doorknob, her eyes sharp and exhausted. "I'll be honest," Tessa said. Grace turned slowly. For one strange second, she thought honesty might be the first kind thing either of them had received all week. Then Tessa gave that small laugh. "I'll take all of your son's property," she said. "Every bit of it. The truck, the accounts, the tools, and his half of this house. So if you're planning to live off what he built forever, don't." Grace did not understand the sentence at first. She heard the words, but grief made them arrive separately, as if each one had to travel through cold water before it could reach her. His half of this house. She looked at Tessa's face, waiting for a sign that there was something broken or feverish behind the cruelty, some crack in reality that would explain why a woman who had buried her husband only hours earlier was talking about property like this. But Tessa's face remained hard. Grace felt something in her chest tighten, not anger yet, not fully, but something close to the first shape of it. "This is his home," Grace said quietly. "It has always been his home." Tessa stepped farther into the room. "No, it was your home. And then it became the house my husband kept pouring money into because he couldn't say no to you." Grace stared at her. Upstairs, a floorboard creaked. Lily, 10 years old, was in the guest room with coloring books and headphones, hidden away from the adults who kept breaking in different directions around her. The sound of that small movement overhead was the only reason Grace did not answer sharply. Instead, she said, "You should go home." Tessa's mouth twitched, but not with softness. "That is exactly what I'm trying to make possible." Then she turned, walked out the front door, and left Grace alone with the lilies, the casserole dishes, and the terrible knowledge that her son had not even been in the ground for half a day before someone had begun measuring what he had left behind. If grief had not already split Grace's life into a before and an after, that moment would have done it. Because until then, she had still believed that no matter how strained things had become over the years, Michael's death would at least strip away the smaller bitterness. It would leave only sorrow, only family, only whatever was most human in them. Instead, it had done the opposite. It had revealed what had been waiting underneath. Grace Holloway was 64 years old, widowed for 11 years, and the kind of woman people described as steady, even when what they really meant was that she had learned how to collapse quietly. Her husband, Frank, had died in the winter, 1 week after Christmas, from a heart attack so sudden that she had spent the first 6 months afterward expecting him to walk back into the house and ask why the thermostat was set too low. He had been the louder one, the one who repaired things before they fully broke, the one who understood bills and gutters and engines and people. Grace had been the keeper of smaller order. She remembered birthdays. She ironed church clothes. She knew which drawer held batteries and which drawer held candles. She had raised their only son into a man who called every Sunday and never arrived empty-handed. After Frank died, the house nearly went with him. There had been debt Grace had not known about and paperwork she did not know how to untangle. The mortgage had a balloon payment she had misunderstood. Her part-time income from the library and Frank's reduced pension were not enough for the refinance the bank required. For one panicked month, she had lived with a yellow legal pad on the kitchen table, writing down numbers she could not make behave. Michael had been 28 then, broad-shouldered, newly engaged, and already carrying the calm, practical kindness that made strangers trust him within minutes. He had sat across from Grace at that same kitchen table and looked at the numbers with her until midnight. Then he had said the thing that changed everything. "I'll go on the mortgage with you." Grace had said no immediately, then no again. Then she had cried, because grief had made pride feel childish, and fear had made pride impossible. The bank approved the refinance only if Michael's name went on the deed alongside hers. "It's paperwork," he told her. "That's all. It keeps you here." At the time, Tessa was still his fiancée. She had been polite about it when Michael told her, even understanding on the surface. Grace remembered that much clearly. Tessa had sat in Grace's living room with a mug of tea balanced neatly between her hands and said, "Of course he should help you. Family helps family." Grace had thanked her. What she had not heard, because Michael did not repeat it and Tessa did not say it in front of her, was the rest of the sentence Tessa had given him in the car afterward. Family helps family, but it should not become a permanent arrangement. In those early years, nothing looked dangerous from the outside. Michael and Tessa married in the fall. They rented a townhouse 15 minutes away. Michael built his contracting business slowly, beginning with kitchen repairs and deck work, and eventually taking on bigger remodeling jobs. Tessa worked in insurance processing, organized every drawer she touched, and kept their lives running with a kind of quiet efficiency Grace admired, even when it made her feel clumsy by comparison. Then Lily was born, and for a while the family settled into a pattern that appeared almost enviable. Sunday dinners rotated between houses. Grace kept Lily on Thursdays when Tessa worked late. Michael fixed loose railings at Grace's place and stayed for soup. Tessa brought store-bought pies at Thanksgiving and apologized for not baking. Grace always said there was nothing to apologize for. If strangers had watched them from a distance, they would have seen an ordinary family, a close one even. But closeness could hide imbalance the way a neat bedspread hid broken springs. Michael never treated helping his mother like a burden. That was one of the things that made the arrangement so easy to excuse. He replaced a water heater, paid for roof shingles one year when a storm tore them loose, handled the property tax website when Grace forgot her password, and brushed off every thanks with the same shrug. "It's fine, Mom." Or, "Don't worry about it." Or, "It's just easier if I do it." Grace told herself she was not asking too much because she rarely asked at all. Michael noticed what needed doing. Michael offered, Michael insisted. And because he was her son, and because grief had left a hollow in the house that only family ever seemed to soften, Grace accepted more than she should have. Tessa noticed that too. At first, the signs were so small, Grace could pretend she was imagining them. A pause that lasted a beat too long when Michael said he had to stop by his mother's place before dinner. A polite smile that did not reach the eyes when Grace thanked him for replacing the old back steps. A comment at a barbecue. "Your mother's house gets better upgrades than ours," delivered with a laugh that invited everyone to treat it as a joke. Michael always smoothed it over. "She's kidding." Sometimes she was, sometimes she was not. The first time Grace felt the shape of the resentment clearly was on an anniversary in late October. Michael and Tessa had planned dinner downtown. Lily was staying with Grace. At 4 that afternoon, the furnace in Grace's house stopped working. The temperature was dropping fast, and a sharp wind had begun pushing leaves against the windows in dry, frantic bursts. Grace called Michael because she did not know who else to call. She told herself she only wanted the name of a repair company. Michael arrived himself 20 minutes later. He spent an hour in the basement with a flashlight and another 30 minutes at the hardware store. By the time the heat came back on, Tessa had called 3 times. Michael answered the last one in the backyard, his shoulders tight, his voice lower than usual. When he came inside, he kissed Lily on the head, told Grace everything was fine, and left wearing the expression of a man who had already disappointed someone he loved and planned to do it again. The next Sunday at dinner, Tessa smiled through the meal and asked Grace to pass the green beans. Then, as if mentioning the weather, she said, "It must be nice to know Michael will drop everything when you need him." Silence spread lightly over the table. Grace looked down at her plate. Michael said, "Tess." Tessa lifted one shoulder. "What? I said it must be nice." Grace went home that night with a pie plate on her lap and a heaviness she could not name without accusing herself first. After that, the pattern became harder to ignore. There was the spring Michael paid to have 2 dead trees removed from Grace's yard because one had started leaning toward the roof. Tessa found out the money had come from their joint savings and did not speak to Grace for nearly 2 weeks. There was the summer afternoon at Lily's 8th birthday party when Tessa watched Michael carry boxes from Grace's garage to the curb and said to another parent, loud enough for Grace to hear, "Some women never stop being the center of their sons' lives. They just learn how to call it help." There was Christmas, when Michael gave Grace a new armchair for her reading nook, and Tessa gave him a look so flat and cold that even Lily noticed and asked later, in the whispering way children do when they are trying to be respectful of pain they do not understand, "Did Mommy get mad because Grandma liked her present?" Grace always tried to protect Tessa in those moments, at least in her own mind. She told herself that marriage was complicated, money was stressful, and no woman wanted to feel like she came second in her own household. Tessa was not wrong to want boundaries. She was not wrong to want Michael's time, his money, his energy to belong first to the family he had built with her. The problem was that Michael had never behaved as if those loyalties needed to compete. He loved them both. That was the simplest truth in the family, and, as it turned out, one of the most damaging. He loved his wife enough to promise every year that things would get easier once a bigger project cleared, once their savings improved, once Grace sold the house, once Lily was older. And he loved his mother enough to keep postponing every conversation that might have forced a real decision. Grace knew that now. She knew it later, when knowing no longer helped anyone. At the time, she only knew that something in Michael had grown more tired. He still came by. He still fixed what broke. He still called on Sundays. But there were evenings when he sat at Grace's kitchen table with both hands wrapped around his coffee cup and stared at nothing for a few seconds too long before speaking. There were days when Lily mentioned that Mommy and Daddy had one of their quiet fights, which sounded gentler than it was. There were moments when Tessa arrived to pick Lily up and barely crossed the threshold before looking around the room as if taking inventory of what Michael's time had purchased there. The worst argument Grace ever overheard happened by accident. Michael had come by one Thursday to replace a window latch in the back bedroom. Grace was in the laundry room when his phone rang. He answered in the hall. She did not mean to listen, but grief and age and old houses made privacy unreliable. Voices carried. I said I'd be home by 6. Pause. No, I'm at Mom's. Longer pause, then more quietly. That's not fair. Grace stood still with a basket of towels in her arms and wished she could vanish. Tessa's voice crackled through the phone, too muffled for words but sharp enough for emotion. Michael said, "It isn't choosing her over you." Another burst from the phone. Then the sentence Grace would remember long after the exact wording should have blurred. She's my mother, Tess. I'm not going to act like she's a problem to solve. He listened again. When he answered this time, the exhaustion in his voice was so deep it made Grace grip the edge of the dryer. And you're my wife. I know that. But I can't keep having this same fight. After he hung up, he stood in the hallway for a full 10 seconds before coming back into the kitchen. His expression had already been rearranged into something calm. Grace hated him for that in the smallest, most helpless way a mother could hate the decency of her child. Not because he had done anything wrong, but because she could see the cost of it. That night, she told him she had been thinking about selling the house. He looked up from tightening the new latch. Have you? No, she admitted. Not really, but maybe I should. Michael leaned against the window frame. His hair had more gray in it than Frank's had at the same age. Grace had been pretending not to notice. Do you want to? Grace looked around the room. The wallpaper was older than his marriage. The curtains had been chosen when Lily was still a baby because they let in soft, morning light. Frank had painted the trim 3 summers before he died. No, she said. Then don't. Tessa thinks... Michael cut her off gently. Tessa thinks a lot of things when she's worried. There it was again. The smoothing over. The refusal to place any pain fully in one person's hands. Grace almost pushed harder. Instead, she asked if he wanted chicken salad for dinner. He smiled and said yes. That was Michael's gift and Michael's flaw. He could make avoidance look like kindness. 6 months before he died, he came over with a folder. It was a windy Saturday in March. Grace was trimming dead stalks from the hydrangeas when Michael pulled into the driveway and carried the folder inside like it weighed more than paper should. What's that? She asked. Just some documents I need to keep somewhere safe." "Why not at your house?" He gave a quick shrug. "Because Lily uses my office for art projects and because you still lock the side door like it's 1974. Grace smiled. "Because it should be locked like it's 1974. He smiled back, but only for a second. She noticed then that he looked thinner. Not sick, exactly. Only drained. "Everything all right?" "Yeah," he said. Then, after the pause that had become too familiar, "Mostly." She waited. He opened the cedar chest in the front room, the one that had belonged to Frank's mother, and placed the folder inside beneath old photo albums and a folded baby blanket Grace had not had the heart to part with. "What kind of documents?" she asked. "Boring grown-up stuff." "Michael." He looked at her then, and for one small, fragile moment, she thought he might finally say the thing he had been holding back for years. About Tessa. About money. About whatever strain had turned his shoulders inward lately and carved new lines beside his mouth. Instead, he kissed the top of her head and said, "If I ever need them, I know where they are." It was not an answer, and Grace knew it. Still, she let it stand. That was the last private thing Michael ever asked of her. The accident happened on a Tuesday in April under a sky so ordinary, no one would have remembered it if it had not become the background of disaster. Michael was driving back from a job site 2 counties over. The roads were slick from a quick afternoon rain. A delivery truck lost control at an overpass. The state trooper used words like collision and impact and immediate. Grace remembered none of the sequence, only the shape of the uniform in her doorway and the realization, brutal and absolute, that life could amputate itself in the space between one breath and the next. The next 4 days passed without structure. Grace signed papers she did not read. She sat in a funeral home choosing a coffin she would not have believed possible to choose for a child. She watched Lily cling to a stuffed rabbit while adults talked around her in lowered voices. She saw Tessa functioning with a terrible precision, making calls, approving flower arrangements, arranging rides, confirming the obituary, thanking people for food. Once, in the hallway outside the chapel, Grace reached for her hand. Tessa let her hold it for exactly 3 seconds before pulling away to answer another phone call. By the day of the funeral, the 2 women had become satellites in the same ruined sky, orbiting the same absence without touching. Then came the laughter. Then came the threat. And after that, the legal language began arriving with almost indecent speed. 2 days after the burial, Tessa sent Michael's cousin to collect his tools from Grace's garage. 3 days after that, a polite but severe email arrived from a probate attorney named Alan Pierce, requesting a full inventory of any property belonging to Michael that remained at Grace's residence. The list included his truck title, business records, personal electronics, financial statements, and documentation regarding real property in which the decedent held an ownership interest. Grace read the email 3 times before understanding that real property meant her house. Or more precisely, the house that had become only partly hers the day Michael signed his name beside hers on the deed. She called the number at the bottom of the message with trembling hands. "Mr." Pierce's voice was smooth and sympathetic in the way professional voices often are when sympathy costs them nothing. "My client," he said, "wishes to ensure that her late husband's estate is properly marshaled." Grace sat at the kitchen table gripping the phone so hard her fingers hurt. "This is my home." "Mrs. Holloway," he said, "the deed reflects joint ownership between you and the decedent. Because he helped me refinance 11 years ago." I understand. But as his surviving spouse, Ms. Holloway may have a legal interest in his share. May have. It was the kind of phrase that sounded cautious and therefore honest, but Grace heard what lived inside it. Tessa was coming for the house. That evening, Grace opened the deed folder she kept in her filing cabinet and stared at the names until they stopped looking like names and became a trap she had helped build herself. Frank Holloway had loved this house for reasons practical men rarely bothered to explain. It sat on a quiet street in Akron with a deep front porch, 2 maples in the yard, and a narrow hallway that always smelled faintly of old wood and lemon polish. Michael had learned to ride a bike in the driveway. Frank had measured his height in pencil marks on the pantry door. Grace had once spent an entire August repainting the guest room yellow because Michael said it looked like sunshine even on cloudy days. Now the paper in front of her told a colder story. Grace Holloway and Michael Holloway, joint tenants with rights of survivorship. She stared at the phrase until memory forced its way in. The bank had required it. It's just how they need it structured, Michael had said. At the time, survivorship had sounded like protection. Now Grace saw the other side of it. If Michael had survived her, the house would have passed fully to him, and if the ownership had later been severed or changed, something Grace had never followed closely enough to understand, then his share might now be estate property. She did not know. She hated that she did not know. Frank had managed these things. Then Michael had. Grace had spent most of her adult life trusting men she loved to understand paperwork. By Friday, she could not bear her own helplessness any longer. She called an attorney recommended by her pastor's wife, a probate litigator named Naomi Bennett, who spoke quickly, dressed plainly, and did not use false softness to make harsh facts easier. Naomi reviewed the deed, the refinance documents, and the email from Mr. Pierce. Then she asked one question. Did Michael leave a will? Grace blinked. I don't know. Naomi sat back in her chair. Then that's the first thing we find out. Grace hesitated. Wouldn't Tessa know? Naomi gave her a look too professional to be called dry. Perhaps. Whether she has told you is a different matter. That afternoon, for the first time since Michael had hidden the folder in the cedar chest, Grace remembered it. The realization hit so suddenly she had to grip the arms of Naomi's office chair. There may be papers at my house, she said. Naomi's eyes sharpened. What kind of papers? I don't know. My son put them away months ago. Then we look now. They drove back to the house together. Grace felt almost guilty opening the cedar chest, as if she were touching something private before Michael had given permission. But death had stripped permission of meaning. All that remained now were consequences. The folder was still there beneath the photo albums. Grace lifted it with both hands. Michael's handwriting was on the front in black marker. Personal/estate/house. Naomi did not open it immediately. She waited until they were seated at the dining room table, the same table where Michael had once balanced a calculator and saved the house. Inside were bank statements, insurance forms, business papers, and clipped neatly at the center, a will signed 6 months earlier. Grace's breath caught. Naomi read in silence for a full minute. Then she looked up. Mrs. Holloway, she said, your son did leave instructions. Grace could not make herself ask. She only waited. Naomi turned the document so Grace could see the relevant page, though the words blurred instantly. Michael's half-interest in the home on Wexler Avenue was to be placed in a testamentary trust. Grace Holloway would have the right to reside in the home for the remainder of her life, with maintenance obligations shared by the trust and Grace according to listed percentages. Upon Grace's death or permanent departure from the home, Michael's interest would pass to Lily Holloway. Tessa was named beneficiary of the life insurance and most liquid business assets. Lily had a separate educational trust. Naomi tapped a second document and said Michael had also signed a transfer affidavit clarifying that the house interest was his separate property, acquired before marriage. Grace looked at the page and then at Naomi. Her first feeling was not relief. It was shock. Michael had known. He had known enough to plan. He had known enough to sign papers, organize them, and hide them in his mother's house instead of his own. Naomi was already reading ahead. This doesn't end the matter, not necessarily, but it changes the entire posture. Grace kept staring at the signature at the bottom of the page. Michael's handwriting was steady. There was no sign in it of fear or urgency or illness, just intention. He thought this would happen, Grace whispered. Naomi did not answer. She did not need to. The will should have made Grace feel safe. Instead, it made her understand how long her son had been standing in the middle of a fight he no longer believed he could prevent. Tessa's reaction came fast. When Mr. Pierce received the will from Naomi that evening, he requested a formal probate conference for Monday morning. Grace barely slept that weekend. She moved through the house, touching objects without purpose. The stair rail Michael had refinished, the porch light he had replaced, the pantry door with its pencil marks. She felt protected and accused at the same time. On Sunday night, Lily called from Tessa's phone. "Grandma?" The sound of her granddaughter's voice nearly broke Grace in half. "Oh, sweetheart." Lily was crying, but trying not to cry hard, the way children do when they fear being overheard by the wrong adult. "Mom says we can't come over for a while." Grace closed her eyes. "I know. Did you take Daddy's house?" The question hung in the air like a blade no one wanted to acknowledge using. Grace sat down slowly at the kitchen table. "No, honey. This house was always Grandma's house, too. But Mom said—" "It's okay," Grace said gently, though nothing about it was okay. "Your mom is upset. Everyone is upset." Lily sniffed. "Daddy said this house smelled like Sunday." Grace put one hand over her mouth. Michael had said that as a teenager once, laughing because Frank always started pot roast too early and Grace always polished the hall table before church. "I remember," Grace said. "Can I still come there?" "Yes," Grace said before caution could intervene. "Always." The line went silent for a second. Then Tessa's voice, hard and clipped, came onto the phone. "That promise isn't yours to make." And the call ended. The probate conference was held in a low brick building that smelled faintly of copier toner and coffee. Grace wore a navy suit she had not needed in years. Naomi carried 2 folders and no visible patience. Tessa arrived 10 minutes late in a cream blouse and dark slacks, looking beautiful in the brittle way some women did when beauty had become armor. Her eyes were shadowed. Her mouth was set. She did not look at Grace. Mr. Pierce opened with condolences, then moved almost immediately into challenge language. His client, he explained, had concerns regarding the circumstances of the will's execution, the classification of the house interest as separate property, and possible undue influence given Michael's ongoing obligations to his mother. Grace had expected anger. She had not expected to hear her motherhood described like a corrupting force. Naomi's response was clinical and devastating. "The asset predates the marriage. We have the deed history. We have the refinance records. We have the signed declaration. We have 2 independent witnesses to execution and a drafting attorney. If your client wishes to allege undue influence, she may do so in court and lose expensively. Tessa spoke for the first time then. He changed those papers without telling me. Naomi said, he was not legally required to obtain your permission regarding his separate property. Tessa's gaze snapped to Grace. Of course he wasn't. He only ever needed hers. There it was. Not grief, not law. The old wound beneath both. Grace felt Naomi shift beside her, ready to object or redirect, but she lifted one hand slightly. She did not know why. Perhaps because after days of legal language, the truth sounded cleaner. Tessa leaned forward. Do you know what it was like, she asked, to build a life with a man who could never say no to his mother? Do you know what it was like to budget for school clothes and roof repairs and car payments while he kept one foot in this house like he was still a son first and a husband second? Grace answered carefully. Michael loved this family. He loved every crisis he had to solve. Tessa shot back. And you let him. The room went very still. Mr. Pierce murmured, Tessa. But she was already beyond embarrassment. He promised we'd sell this place someday. He promised we'd use that money for Lily, for a better neighborhood, for a yard big enough that she didn't have to share a wall with strangers when we could finally move. Tessa laughed again then, but this time the sound was raw enough to show the grief inside it. I spent 10 years waiting for someday. Then he died, and somehow even dead he still chose this house. Grace looked at her and saw for the first time since the funeral, not just cruelty, but panic. Naomi ended the meeting before it could rot further. There would be no agreement that day. Tessa reserved the right to challenge. Grace's occupancy rights stood pending further action. Outside in the parking lot, wind tugged at everyone's coats. Tessa walked to her car without another word. Halfway there, Lily, who had apparently been in the back seat with a babysitter Naomi had not noticed, lifted her face to the window. Grace saw her granddaughter's small hand press briefly against the glass before the car pulled away. That night, Grace opened the cedar folder again. There were documents Naomi had already copied and organized. There were insurance forms. There was a list of passwords. And at the bottom, tucked beneath the will, there was an envelope with Grace's name on it in Michael's handwriting. She sat at the kitchen table and stared at it for a long time before opening it. Mom, if you're reading this, something happened before I got the chance to explain things myself. I hope that isn't the case. I hope this letter stays unnecessary and embarrassing and gets found 20 years from now when Lily is cleaning out closets and making fun of how many labels I put on folders. Grace had to stop there because she was already crying too hard to see. When she could continue, the words came like his voice in the next room. I need you to know that if I changed the papers on the house, it wasn't because I wanted a fight. It was because I could see one coming, even if nobody would say it out loud. You should not have to spend the rest of your life wondering whether you'll lose your home because I helped save it once. He went on to explain what Grace had not allowed herself to ask. Tessa had been pushing for 2 years to liquidate Michael's interest in the house. She wanted them to use the value toward a larger home in a better school district. Michael agreed with the goal. He disagreed with the cost. There were fights, some loud, many quiet. They had tried counseling once. They had quit too soon. Grace kept reading through tears that turned whole sentences watery. This is the part I don't know how to write without making someone the villain, and I don't think there is one. Tessa is scared about money more than she admits. She's scared of instability because she grew up with too much of it. I know that. I also know I kept trying to solve everything by stretching myself thinner, and that isn't the same as solving it. Grace pressed the page flat. I should have set better boundaries years ago. With her. With you. Maybe with myself most of all. If you ever feel guilty reading this, don't let guilt turn into surrender. Staying in your home isn't taking from Lily. That's why I left my share to her after you. I wanted both of you protected. I just couldn't figure out how to make everyone feel protected at the same time. There was more. Please don't turn Lily against her mother, no matter what happens. And if Tessa says cruel things after I'm gone, remember she says her worst things when she feels cornered. That doesn't excuse them. It just means pain has a shape. Love. Michael. Grace finished the letter with one hand pressed hard against her chest. The house had never felt emptier than it did in that moment, with his handwriting in front of her and no way to answer him. For 3 days, she moved through life with the letter folded in her purse. Tessa filed the contest on Thursday. The petition alleged that Michael had been under emotional pressure from Grace, that the house arrangement had long functioned as marital support to Grace, and that fairness demanded equitable relief. It was not an elegant filing, Naomi said, but it was enough to create delay, stress, and expense. Grace nodded as if delay, stress, and expense were manageable categories. What she was not prepared for was the cruelty that came with the waiting. Tessa stopped all visits with Lily. School pickups that Grace had handled for years were reassigned. Church was skipped on Sundays they once spent together. The spare toothbrush Grace kept in the upstairs bathroom, for Lily gathered dust. Once, from the grocery store parking lot, Grace saw Tessa loading bags into the trunk and Lily climbing into the back seat. Grace lifted one hand without thinking. Lily started to wave. Tessa closed the car door quickly and drove away. Naomi advised patience. Do not confront her alone. Do not leave messages you wouldn't want read in a courtroom. Do not let grief make you impulsive. Grace agreed to all of it, and then went home and stood in Lily's room crying over a dollhouse missing one tiny blue chair. By June, the legal challenge had become its own season. Depositions were scheduled, financial records were exchanged. Naomi uncovered proof that Michael had paid most of the property taxes on Grace's house directly from a business account, classified separately from marital funds. Mr. Pierce countered with invoices for improvements Tessa claimed had come from joint savings. The matter narrowed and sharpened until everyone involved was speaking less about a man who had died and more about ledger categories. Grace hated that most of all. Michael's life was being reduced to line items. Then Naomi found something else. A series of emails between Michael and the attorney who drafted the will. One line in particular changed the emotional weather of everything. Client reports increasing marital conflict regarding mother's residence. Wishes to ensure mother cannot be displaced if client dies unexpectedly or in event of divorce. Divorce? Grace read the word twice. Naomi looked at her carefully. There's more. There usually was. Michael and Tessa had been discussing a trial separation. Nothing had been filed. Nothing formal had begun. But the attorney's notes referenced Michael's concern that if the marriage ended badly, Tessa might attempt to force a sale of the house as leverage. He wanted the documents completed before any disclosure. Grace sat in Naomi's office with the note in her lap and felt an unexpected pulse of shame. Not because Michael had considered leaving his wife. That was between them. Because her son had been living inside a crisis large enough to reach the word divorce, and she had let herself remain half blind to it, because clarity might have required action. That night she took out Michael's letter again and reread the sentence about villains. There isn't one. She was not sure he was right, but she began to understand what he meant. 2 weeks later, Lily appeared on Grace's porch, not alone. A patrol officer stood behind her, and Tessa's face was white with fury at the curb. It was a custody misunderstanding, Naomi said later. Tessa had listed Grace as an unauthorized contact at school months earlier and forgotten to update one form. Lily had gotten sick in class, asked for Grandma, and the school secretary had called the only emergency number she knew would answer on the first ring. Grace had driven there without thinking. Then Tessa had arrived to find her daughter wrapped in Grace's old cardigan in the nurse's office, and all the anger that had been brewing for months found a public place to spill. "You don't get to slide back into our lives through paperwork," Tessa snapped on Grace's porch while the officer pretended not to hear. Lily stood between them with tear-streaked cheeks. Grace wanted to say 100 things. She wanted to say that Lily was not paperwork, that she had only come because a child was sick and asking for her, that nobody should be fighting over a little girl who had already buried her father. Instead, she said the only thing that might keep the moment from worsening. She was scared. Tessa's eyes filled suddenly, startling them both. "So am I," she said. For a second, nobody moved. Then Tessa gathered Lily toward the car and left. Grace stood on the porch after they were gone, Michael's cardigan still warm in her hands, and felt the cruel, complicated truth of it. Tessa was frightened enough to become ruthless, and Grace was wounded enough to become stubborn, and a dead man's absence sat between them, turning every old grievance into something sharpened. The hearing was set for late August. Summer moved around Grace without entering her. Hydrangeas bloomed and browned. The neighbor's grandson mowed her lawn twice without being asked. Church ladies brought peach cobbler. Naomi prepared affidavits. Mr. Pierce submitted objections. Every week added cost. Grace considered settlement more than once. She could have agreed to sell. She could have taken her small share of the equity, found a condo, given up the porch, the pantry door, the smell of Sunday, and called it peace. But every time she pictured herself leaving, she saw not freedom, but erasure. Not only of Frank and Michael, but of her own last stable ground. And each time she opened Michael's letter, one line rose stronger than the rest. Don't let guilt turn into surrender. On the morning of the hearing, Grace woke before dawn and sat in the kitchen while the coffee brewed. The house was silent except for the refrigerator hum and the faint ticking of the clock over the stove. She looked around the room and thought about how many versions of herself had lived here. The young wife unpacking wedding gifts, the tired mother making school lunches, the widow learning bank passwords, the grandmother cutting apple slices, the old woman suddenly required to defend the right to remain where every version had happened. By the time Naomi knocked on the front door, Grace had made peace with at least one thing. She would not leave the courthouse ashamed. The hearing itself was less dramatic than the months leading up to it, which somehow made it crueler. Mr. Pierce argued fairness, contribution, marital expectation, emotional coercion. He painted Grace as dependent, Michael as burdened, Tessa as a surviving spouse cut out of a significant asset through secretive last-minute estate planning. Naomi responded with documents, dates, and the clean force of facts. The property interest predated the marriage. The trust protected Grace for life, and then passed to Lily. Not to a stranger, not to a charity, not to some hidden beneficiary. Michael had explicitly provided other assets for Tessa. There was no evidence of incapacity, no evidence of coercion, no legal basis to override intent simply because intent caused pain. Grace testified briefly. Her voice shook only once, when asked whether Michael had ever promised she could stay in the home. He didn't need to promise. she said. He helped me keep it when I couldn't do it alone. He knew what it meant. Tessa testified after her. Grace had prepared herself for more anger. Instead, what came out sounded almost worse because it was true enough to cut. I spent years feeling like my husband was split in half, Tessa said. Part of him was always somewhere else. At her house, solving her problems, carrying her loneliness, financing repairs we couldn't afford. Maybe he meant well. Maybe she never demanded it. But it shaped our marriage anyway. Grace sat still and let the words land. Because they did contain truth. Not all the truth. Not enough truth to win the case. But truth. When the judge asked whether the trust arrangement harmed Lily, Tessa's answer broke at the edges. It delays what could have helped her now. Naomi stood for rebuttal. It gives Lily a future interest in property her father specifically wanted, preserved for both his mother and his daughter. The law does not convert grief into entitlement, simply because one grief is louder than another. The ruling came 2 weeks later. The trust stood. Grace retained the right to remain in the house for life, subject to the maintenance terms Michael had set. Lily remained remainder beneficiary of Michael's share. Tessa's challenge was dismissed. Each side would bear its own fees. Naomi called with the news while Grace was deadheading roses by the porch. Grace listened, thanked her, hung up. Then she sat on the top step and cried with relief so fierce it left her lightheaded. She cried for the victory, yes, for the house, for the fact that Michael had not failed in the one protection he had tried to build. But she cried even harder because winning did not bring him back, and because there are victories that still leave a family ruined. The next knock on her door came 6 days later. Tessa stood there alone. She looked smaller without anger holding her upright. Not older, exactly. Just worn down to the human being underneath the performance of certainty. Grace did not invite her in immediately. Tessa noticed that and gave one humorless nod. Fair. Neither woman spoke for a moment. Finally, Grace stepped aside. They sat in the living room where Lily had once built blanket forts between the sofa and armchair. The afternoon light came through the lace curtains in long, pale bars. Tessa placed a manila envelope on the coffee table. I'm not here to reopen anything, she said. The appeal window is short and I'm not appealing. Grace waited. There are copies of Lily's school calendar in there, and her soccer schedule, and a list of things Michael used to do with her that she keeps asking about. Grace looked at the envelope but did not touch it. Tessa stared at her own hands. Her nails were bitten shorter than Grace had ever seen them. I was cruel at the funeral, she said at last. Grace almost laughed at the smallness of the description. Tessa shook her head before Grace could answer. No. Let me say it right. I was vicious. I knew exactly where to hit. And I did it because if I was the one saying ugly things first, then I didn't have to be the one left behind. The honesty in that sentence was so naked, it made the room feel more private than either of them wanted. Grace asked quietly, Left behind by whom? Tessa looked up, and for the first time since Michael died, there was no shield in her face. By everyone, she said. The word rested between them. Not just by Michael, by the life she thought they were building, by the future she had counted on, by the version of herself who had believed hard work and planning could prevent catastrophe if done correctly enough. Grace folded her hands in her lap. He left you provided for. I know. But it wasn't enough. Tessa's mouth tightened. It wasn't what I thought we had. There it was. Not greed, not only greed, expectation, claim, Fear dressed up as arithmetic for so many years that even Tessa had begun to confuse one for the other. Grace thought of Michael's letter in her purse upstairs. He wanted Lily protected, Grace said. And me. Tessa nodded once. I know that now. Did you? Tessa inhaled shakily. I knew he wanted both. I just thought if he loved us enough, he'd find a way to make both happen without me having to lose. Grace considered that. And when he didn't? Tessa looked toward the window. Then I decided someone was taking from me. It was such a simple sentence for damage that had lasted years. Grace realized, not for the first time, that adulthood did not make people less childlike in their wounds. It only taught them better vocabulary. They spoke for almost an hour that afternoon. Not kindly, not all the time. There were sharp moments, corrections, things one said that the other refused to carry unchallenged. Grace told Tessa she had every right to want Michael home more than he had been. Tessa told Grace she had spent too long pretending not to see how much of Michael's emotional life ran through his mother's house. Grace admitted she had hidden inside helplessness when practical adulthood should have required more of her. Tessa admitted she had used money as the acceptable language for fears she was too proud to name. Neither apologized enough to repair the past. But by the time Tessa stood to leave, something smaller and sturdier than peace had entered the room. Recognition, perhaps. At the door, Tessa said, Lily wants to come by next Saturday, if that's still all right. Grace's throat tightened. Yes. Tessa nodded again. Then, with one hand on the screen door, she said, She still says this house smells like Sunday. After she left, Grace sat in the front hall crying in a way that no longer felt like collapse. More like weather finally moving through. Lily's first visit back was awkward for almost 12 minutes. She stood in the doorway with a backpack and a guarded expression that did not belong on a 10-year-old's face. Grace let her choose the pace. They made grilled cheese. They watered the porch ferns. They avoided the upstairs room where old routines lived too obviously. Then Lily saw Michael's fishing tackle box in the hall closet and asked whether Grandma still remembered how Daddy used to untangle the line without getting mad. Grace smiled through tears. Your father got mad at a great many things. Fishing line was one of them. Lily laughed. The sound changed the house. After that, visits became regular but not casual. Tessa did not stay long at first. Sometimes she remained in the car, scrolling through her phone while Lily spent 3 hours baking cookies or sorting through family photos with Grace. Sometimes she came in, accepted tea, and sat stiffly at the table while Lily did homework. Over time, stiffness gave way to habit. Habit gave way, not to warmth exactly, but to a working respect. Grace learned not to offer unsolicited advice about school choices or meal plans. Tessa learned not to flinch every time Michael's name came up in the house. Lily moved between them with the instinctive skill children develop when adults finally stop asking them to carry emotional freight. In October, Grace did something that surprised Naomi, the pastor's wife, and perhaps herself most of all. She asked Naomi to draft an amendment to her own estate documents. When Naomi came to the house with the paperwork, she raised one eyebrow after reading the changes. You're leaving your personal share of the home to Lily as well? Grace nodded. Eventually. Naomi glanced up. And the discretionary maintenance reserve? Also for the house, and for her education if the house is sold after I'm gone. Naomi set down her pen. You understand this benefits Tessa indirectly. Grace looked toward the front yard, where Lily was trying to teach the old golden retriever next door to chase bubbles. Yes, she said. Children almost always force that kind of mathematics. Naomi smiled despite herself. You are not required to be generous. No, Grace said, but I'm required to decide who I want to be after all of this. That winter, on the first anniversary of Michael's death, the three of them went to the cemetery together. The sky was gray and low. Lily carried a single sunflower, because she said lilies were beautiful but too sad-looking. Grace brought a thermos of coffee the way Frank used to on cold mornings. Tessa wore no armor Grace could recognize, only a dark coat and a tired face and gloves she kept forgetting to pull all the way on. They stood at Michael's grave in a silence that no longer felt like competition. Lily talked first, telling her father she had made the honor roll and that Grandma still burned toast when distracted, and that Mom had finally let her paint one wall in her bedroom green. Tessa laughed softly at that, and even Grace smiled. When Lily wandered a few feet away to look at another headstone decorated with pinwheels, Grace and Tessa remained side by side. I used to think love in a family was supposed to feel fair, Tessa said quietly, eyes on the granite. Grace answered after a moment. I used to think love meant giving until nobody could accuse you of holding anything back. Tessa looked down. That didn't work out well for either of us. No, Grace said. It didn't. They stood a little longer in the cold. Then Tessa said the sentence Grace had once wanted with all the hunger of the newly wronged. I'm sorry. Not enough to erase the funeral. Not enough to erase the court filings or the weeks without Lily. Not enough to erase the years Michael had spent being stretched between them. But enough to let Grace stop imagining the apology as a locked door she still needed opened. Grace nodded once. I know. And for the first time, she did. Years later, people in the neighborhood would say that the Holloway women had worked things out. Grace never corrected them because the truth required more patience than casual conversation allowed. They had not worked things out in the tidy way people meant. There was no miraculous reunion, no new holiday card with everyone smiling in matching sweaters, no sudden transformation of old pain into easy intimacy. Tessa never became the daughter Grace might once have wanted. Grace never became the uncomplicated mother-in-law Tessa could have trusted without reservation. Some losses did not end when paperwork ended. Some resentments, once grown, did not disappear. They merely learned better manners. What changed instead was quieter. They stopped using Michael's love as a territory to defend. They stopped asking grief to prove ownership. They learned, slowly and imperfectly, that the same man could have failed them both in different ways while loving them fully. That fear could turn practical concerns into cruelty. That loneliness could disguise itself as helplessness. That protecting a child often meant surrendering the satisfaction of being entirely right. Grace stayed in the house on Wexler Avenue. She repaired the porch one spring with money from the maintenance reserve Michael had established. She repainted Lily's old room a soft blue when Lily said yellow made it feel too much like the past. She kept Frank's pencil marks on the pantry door and added Lily's growth beside them in careful dates. On Sundays, when the pot roast cooked too early and the hall table caught the smell of lemon polish, the house still smelled like Sunday. And sometimes, when the light fell a certain way across the kitchen floor, Grace could almost believe Michael had only stepped outside for a minute. But she no longer waited for ghosts to finish conversations the living still had a duty to attempt. That was the real change. Not forgiveness in the grand, cinematic sense. Not justice clean enough to satisfy every wound. Just maturity forced through grief until it became something like wisdom. Grace learned that a home was not only wood and title and inherited habit. It was also the place where illusions eventually had to answer to truth. The truth that her son had loved her and still needed boundaries from her. The truth that Tessa had been cruel and also frightened. The truth that Lily deserved better than inheriting silence sharpened into loyalty tests. In the end, the house did not belong to grief. It did not belong to accusation either. It belonged to time, to memory, to a child still growing, and for a while longer, to the woman who had once feared she would lose it because she had trusted love to handle what law eventually had to settle. Grace sometimes thought back to the laughter after the funeral and felt its sting again. Some injuries never left the body completely, but they changed shape. What had once sounded like triumph now sounded, in memory, like panic with its face uncovered. And maybe that was the final mercy age offered, not forgetting what hurt, but understanding it without needing to be ruled by it. On quiet evenings, Grace would sit on the front porch while the sun lowered itself behind the maples, and Lily, older then, taller, all elbows and opinions and bright, unfinished plans, would sometimes rest her head against Grace's shoulder and ask for stories about her father before she knew him. Grace always told the truth, as best she could. She told her about Michael at 12, trying to mow a crooked line in the yard because Frank had the flu. About Michael at 17, pretending not to cry when he left for his first job out of town. About Michael at 28, sitting at a kitchen table long past midnight, refusing to let fear take the house from his mother. About Michael as a father, kneeling on the living room carpet to help Lily glue macaroni onto construction paper as if it were serious architecture. And when Lily eventually became old enough to understand that adults failed each other not only through betrayal, but through confusion, avoidance, fear, and love badly arranged, Grace told her that too. Not because children should inherit bitterness, because they should inherit honesty. That, Grace came to believe, was the only inheritance that ever made the others bearable. So the story of Michael Holloway's death did not end with a widow's threat or a courtroom victory. It ended, if such stories ever truly ended, with a grandmother who stayed, a mother who softened without surrendering, a daughter who grew up inside the difficult mercy of imperfect adults trying, too late but still trying, to stop making a child pay for what they had broken in each other. And that was not a happy ending. It was something older and more durable than that. It was a family that could no longer pretend. It was a house that remained standing. It was grief made honest enough to live with. And for Grace Holloway, in the long, quiet years that followed, that became its own kind of peace. Sometimes, the miracle God gives is not the miracle people expect. Sometimes He does not remove the pain, restore the years, or bring back what was lost. Sometimes the miracle is quieter than that. Sometimes it is the strength to keep going, the wisdom to see the truth, the grace to let go of bitterness, and the courage to choose peace in the middle of heartbreak. In everyday life, many people carry silent burdens inside their homes, their marriages, and their families. And this story is a reminder that even in those painful places, God is still present. He sees every tear, every unanswered prayer, and every heart that feels tired of being strong. And sometimes, His greatest blessing is not changing the past, but helping a person walk through it with faith, dignity, and hope. If this story touched your heart, please share where you're watching from in the comments, and let me know what part stayed with you the most. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next story. May God bless you, protect your home, bring peace to your heart, and watch over you and your loved ones tonight.